The eastbound train pulled into Sweetwater, Kansas territory at 11 in the morning on a hot June day in 1881, and inside of 90 seconds, a woman in a gray traveling dress was running flat out down the platform, screaming for someone to help her, with half the town watching and nobody moving fast enough to matter. Her name was Ruth Ashford. She had ridden 400 miles to marry a man named Cornelius Vance, a respected stockyard owner who had courted her by letter for 8 months, with a patience and a politeness that had won over her whole family. She had stepped off that train with a hopeful smile rehearsed and ready. She had looked once at the man waiting on the platform with a bouquet of black-eyed Susans, and the smile had come apart on her face like wet paper. She knew him, not from his letters. From a photograph her cousin had shown her 18 months before, a photograph of a different man with a different name entirely, a man her cousin's dearest friend had traveled west to marry and never been heard from again. Ruth Ashford did not wait to find out if she was wrong. She ran. She went off the end of the platform, through a gap in the freight wagons, and straight into the bed of a supply wagon parked in the shade with a canvas tarp half thrown over a load of feed sacks, and she burrowed under that canvas like a rabbit going to ground, and she stayed there, not breathing, while Cornelius Vance's voice rose behind her in the street, calling her name in a tone of wounded confusion that half of Sweetwater found perfectly convincing. The wagon belonged to a cowgirl named Cassidy Doyle, who had been standing 20 feet away buying grain and had seen the whole thing. I have gone back through the county records from that summer more than once, and here is the detail that stops me every time. Cassidy Doyle did not go get the sheriff. She did not go find Cornelius Vance to sort out the misunderstanding. She walked straight to her own wagon, climbed up onto the seat as if nothing in the world were wrong, and drove out of Sweetwater at an entirely unremarkable pace, with a terrified stranger buried under her feed sacks, because Cassidy Doyle had a reason of her own, 3 years old and never once spoken aloud in that town, to believe every word the woman under the canvas would turn out to be right about. We are going to need both of their reasons before this story makes sense. Stay through the quiet part. It gets loud again soon enough. 2 miles out of town, on a bend in the creek road where the cottonwoods gave good cover, Cassidy Doyle pulled up the team and spoke to the feed sacks without turning around. "You can come up for air." Nobody followed. I'd know. The canvas moved. A face appeared, pale, dust-streaked, 22 years old, and considerably less composed than the photograph in Vance's letters had suggested she would be. "You're not going to take me back," Ruth said. It was not quite a question. "I didn't take you anywhere. You climbed into my wagon of your own accord, and I decided against dragging a hysterical woman out of it in front of the whole town, which would have drawn considerably more attention than driving off quiet." Cassidy studied her. "You want to tell me why a bride runs from her own wedding before the man said a word to her?" Ruth told her. About the photograph. About her cousin's friend, a woman named Delia Fromm, who had answered a matrimonial notice from a rancher calling himself Jonas Reed in a county 200 miles north, and had written home twice, cheerful letters, and then had written nothing at all, ever again, and whose family had eventually received a short, sad note from Reed himself, explaining that Delia had run off with a passing drover, not 4 months into the marriage. Shameful business, best not spoken of. "The man on that platform," Ruth said, "is Jonas Reed. I'd stake my life on it. Different name, different county, same face, same black-eyed Susans in his hand, because Delia wrote that he brought her black-eyed Susans too, and thought it a very original thing to do." Cassidy Doyle sat very still on the wagon seat for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that had nothing to do with Ruth Ashford at all. "Ma'am," she said finally, in a voice gone carefully flat, "I am going to ask you to tell me that whole story one more time, slow, and I am going to ask you not to leave out one single detail, because I believe you, and I have been waiting 3 years for somebody to walk into my life and say exactly what you just said." What Cassidy did not tell Ruth that first afternoon, because trust is a thing built in ounces and not poured out in buckets, was that Cassidy Doyle was not, strictly speaking, the name on her own birth record either. What she did do was drive Ruth to a line camp on the back 40 of the ranch where she worked, a rough but sound cabin nobody used in summer, and tell her to stay put, stay quiet, and trust that a search would come and pass, because a search always did. It came faster than either of them liked. By supper time, Cornelius Vance had the whole of Sweetwater looking for his vanished bride, offering a reward of $50 for word of her whereabouts, and telling anyone who would listen that the poor woman had suffered some kind of nervous collapse from the long journey and needed to be found before harm came to her. A story delivered with such convincing distress that the town's sympathy ran entirely his direction. "He'll have men riding every road by morning," Cassidy told Ruth that night, back at the line camp with a lantern turned low. "And he's not fool enough to search forever without cause. Circuit Judge Aldous Price comes through Sweetwater once a quarter to hold court, and he's due Thursday, 3 days from now, gone again by Friday noon. A man like Vance keeps his business quiet right up until court is in session, and loud again the moment the judge leaves, because he's not worried about a sheriff who owes him grazing favors. He's worried about a judge who doesn't." "So we have 3 days, Ruth said. "We have 3 days to put something in front of Judge Price, heavier than your memory of a photograph, because your word against a respected stockman's is a coin flip in front of any judge in this territory, and I intend for this not to be a coin flip." Cassidy's jaw had a set to it that made Ruth, despite everything, feel for the first time in 2 days something close to safe. 3 days to prove Cornelius Vance is Jonas Reed, and Jonas Reed is whoever he was before that, and find out what in creation he does with the women who see through him before the wedding takes. "You said you'd been waiting 3 years, Ruth said quietly, "for somebody to say what I said. What did I say?" Cassidy Doyle looked at the lantern flame for a long moment before she answered. "You said a man gives a woman flowers, courts her 8 months by letter, and then she disappears, and everyone agrees to call it running off with a drover." Her voice had gone very quiet and very even, the way a voice goes when a person has practiced staying calm about something for a long time. "My sister disappeared exactly that way, 2 counties over, 4 years back, married to a rancher who called himself something other than Cornelius Vance at the time. Everyone in that county agreed to call it running off too. I have spent 3 years riding under a different name in 3 different counties, trying to find the man who taught them all to agree on that story so easily. And today, he stood on the Sweetwater platform with black-eyed Susans in his hand. Cassidy Doyle's real name was Cassandra Merrick, and the sister she had lost was named Louisa. Louisa Merrick had been the pretty one, the one who laughed easy and trusted easier. And at 20, she had answered a matrimonial notice from a rancher, calling himself Amos Teller, a man who wrote the kind of letters that made a whole family fall a little in love with him before he ever set foot in their parlor. He had married Louisa in the spring, taken her 2 counties west to his spread, and by autumn, the letters home had turned strange, shorter. Careful in a way, Louisa had never once been careful in her life, as if she were choosing each word for someone standing over her shoulder. Then the letters stopped, and 6 weeks after that, a letter came instead from Amos Teller himself, grieved and apologetic, explaining that Louisa had taken up with a passing horse trader and left him a note and a great deal of heartbreak, and that he hoped the family would not think too poorly of him for a wife's failing that was surely no fault of his own. Cassandra Merrick had been 18 years old, and she had not believed one word of that letter, and nobody in her family had wanted to hear why. My father said some things a body just has to let lie, she told Ruth, out at the line camp, with 3 days now feeling considerably shorter than it had the night before. My mother said hunting after it would only bring more shame down on the family name. I said the family name was the least of what got lost, and I left home inside a month, cut my hair, and started riding under Doyle, which was my grandmother's maiden name, and nobody's business but mine. She had worked her way through 3 counties over 3 years, hiring on as a hand wherever the work was steady, asking careful questions in saloons and church socials and cattle auctions, looking for the shape of a story. She had come to recognize the way you recognize a particular gait in a horse from half a mile off. A charming rancher, a whirlwind courtship by letter, a bride who vanished within the year, always blamed for her own disappearance, always gone before anyone thought to look hard. She had found 2 more women's names in 3 years, women whose families quietly agreed the missing had brought it on themselves, and she had found, in each case, a man who had moved on to a new county and a new name shortly after, always just ahead of the next hard question. Cornelius Vance is the 4th name I've had on him, she said. Jonas Reed was the 3rd, if your friend Delia's family had it right. Amos Teller was the 1st I know of. I don't yet know his true one, and until 3 days ago, I had begun to fear I never would. Ruth had her own accounting to give, and it filled in gaps Cassandra had been carrying for years without knowing they were gaps at all. Delia Fromm, it turned out, had not vanished as quietly or as completely as Louisa Merrick. Delia had a sister of her own, a sharp, stubborn woman named Prudence who had refused to accept the drover story from the first letter, and who had, in the 18 months since, written to every newspaper and land office within 200 miles, asking after a man named Jonas Reed. Most of her letters had gone nowhere. One had reached Ruth's own mother, a distant cousin of the Fromms, and that was how the photograph had ended up in Ruth's hands at all, tucked into a family letter along with a warning to look twice at any suitor who wrote too beautifully and answered too little about his own kin. Prudence Fromm believes he's done this more than the 2 we know of, Ruth said. She found record, or thought she did, of a fire at a ranch house 2 years back, up near the Nebraska line, that killed a rancher's young wife and was ruled an accident with the stove. Prudence wrote to the county for particulars and never got an answer back at all, which she found stranger than if they'd simply said no. Cassandra went very still at that. 2 years back, near the Nebraska line. You know of it. I rode through that county myself, hunting the same story you are, about 14 months ago. I heard the fire spoken of once, in a hotel dining room, by a woman who said it quiet and changed the subject fast when she saw me listening too close. I never got a name past rancher's wife, God rest her, and I didn't think to connect it to Amos Teller, because by then he'd have needed yet another new name to be operating that far north so soon. Prudence has the name, Ruth said. She wrote it to my mother, Silas Kane. The 2 women sat with that for a moment, the full shape of it settling over them both. Amos Teller, Silas Kane, Jonas Reed, Cornelius Vance. 4 names, at minimum, across 4 counties and perhaps 5 years, and beneath every one of them the same pattern: courtship, marriage, a bride who stopped writing home the way she used to, and then an ending arranged to look like anything other than what it plainly was. We are not looking for a man who lost his temper once, Cassandra said slowly. We are looking for a man with a method, and a method leaves paper behind it somewhere, because a man who has done this 4 times has had to solve the same problems 4 times. Money, land titles. What happens to a bride's dowry when the bride is no longer present to claim it? Where do we find that paper in 2 days? Ruth asked. We find out who's been quietly getting rich off dead and disappeared brides' land claims in this county, Cassandra said, "and I would wager every dollar I own that it traces back to the land office and to a clerk who either helps him for money or is too frightened to say no." The land office in Sweetwater was run by a narrow, anxious man named Everett Kroll, and it took Cassandra exactly one afternoon of watching him to decide he was the second kind of man, the frightened kind, not the willing kind, which meant he was the kind who could be moved. She caught him alone at closing, locking up the office in the long gold light of early evening, and she did not waste his time or hers pretending to be anything other than what she was. "Mr. Kroll, I know Cornelius Vance filed a change of land title inside a year of every wedding he's had, going back at least to a woman named Louisa Merrick, 2 counties over, 4 years past. I know because I am her sister, and I have been 3 years finding my way to this office. I am not here to ruin you. I am here to ask whether you have been sleeping well these 4 years, because a man carrying a secret that size generally hasn't. And Thursday, I intend to hand Judge Price something heavier than an old woman's memory. I would rather it include your name as a witness who finally spoke than as a clerk who helped bury 4 women and said nothing." Everett Kroll did not answer for a long moment. Then he sat back down at his own locked desk, took a small brass key from inside his boot, and opened a bottom drawer that was not, strictly speaking, part of the county's official filing system at all. Inside was a private ledger, kept in his own hand, of every transaction he had processed for a rancher who had held 4 different names on 4 different land patents across 5 years, each one acquired through a marriage, each one transferred to sole ownership within 8 months of the wedding, each one accompanied by a small, unrecorded payment to Everett Kroll himself for what the ledger delicately called expedited processing and discretion. "I told myself the women just left," Kroll said, not meeting her eyes. "I told myself that every single time, because the alternative meant I'd taken money to help bury something I didn't want to look at straight on. I've got 2 daughters of my own, Miss Merrick. I was afraid of the wrong things for entirely too long." "You can be afraid of the right thing now instead," Cassandra said. "Bring that ledger to Judge Price Thursday morning, in your own hand, of your own will, and I promise you every ounce of mercy this territory has to offer will be aimed your direction instead of his. Wait until Thursday afternoon, and I promise you the opposite." Kroll closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something in his face had settled, the particular relief of a frightened man finally choosing the harder, cleaner road. "Thursday morning," he said. "I'll bring it myself." Everett Kroll's ledger was proof of a pattern. It was not, on its own, proof of what had happened to the women, and Cassandra knew the difference would matter enormously to a careful judge. That was where Tom Hartley came in. Tom ran the livery at the edge of town, a quiet, steady man who had watched Cassandra Doyle ride in and out of Sweetwater for the better part of a year, with a patience that had never once asked her a question she did not want to answer. He had noticed, the way a careful man notices things, that Vance's hired hand, a rough sort named Beaufort, had been hauling old trunks and crates out of the Vance property's back shed all that week, ahead of a bonfire Vance had scheduled for Thursday evening, conveniently timed for the exact hour the circuit judge would be riding out of town, satisfied and unopposed. A man doesn't burn a shed full of his dead wife's belongings the week before a judge comes through, unless he means to have nothing left to find, Tom told Cassandra, the evening of the second day, in the low voice of a man committing to something he could not take back. "I can get you into that shed tonight, before Beaufort loads the last of it for the fire. I know the property. I shod half his horses for 2 years before I understood what kind of man I was working for." They went in after midnight, Cassandra and Tom, while Ruth stayed hidden at the line camp with a rifle across her knees and strict instructions to use it only as a very last resort. The shed was exactly as bad as Cassandra had feared, and precisely what she needed. Trunks, dresses gone out of fashion by a decade, a christening gown never used, and in the bottom of a hat box pushed far back under a shelf, a small tin locket on a broken chain, engraved on the back with two initials that stopped Cassandra Merrick's breath in her chest. L.M. Louisa Merrick. She had given her sister that locket herself, for her 16th birthday, with their mother's portrait folded inside it. I will not pretend to you that Cassandra Doyle handled that moment with perfect composure, because she did not, and no honest account of this story should claim she did. She sat down hard on the dirt floor of that shed with her sister's locket in her two hands, and wept the particular grief of a person who has spent 3 years, half hoping to be wrong, and has just been proven right in the worst possible way. Tom Hartley did not try to rush her through it. He simply sat down beside her in the dark and kept watch, and let her have the 2 minutes she needed before they had to move again. The locket did not tell them Louisa was dead. It told them only that Louisa had been in that shed, in that house, and that whatever became of her afterward, she had not simply walked away and left behind the one thing in the world that carried her mother's face. No woman does that willingly. Every woman who has ever packed a bag in the middle of the night knows exactly which small, irreplaceable things go in the bag first. "This is enough," Cassandra said finally, closing her hand around the locket. "Combined with Kroll's ledger and your word about the timing of that bonfire, this is enough to make Judge Price ask the questions Vance can't answer clean. It has to be. They should have been back at the line camp before dawn. They were not, because the barn door they had left unlatched behind them had not, in fact, stayed unlatched by accident, and Beaufort came around the corner of the shed with a lantern and a shotgun at exactly the wrong moment for everyone involved. What followed was not gunplay, and I want to be plain about that, because plenty of tellings of this story have added a shootout that never happened. What happened was worse in a quieter way. Beaufort recognized Tom Hartley immediately, and Tom, with a speed that told Cassandra a great deal about a man she had only ever known as patient, put himself squarely between the lantern light and her hiding place and struck up a loud, rambling story about a horse he'd sold Vance going lame and needing to check the shed for a spare harness. A story so aggressively boring that Beaufort's suspicion visibly drained out of him within a minute, out of sheer tedium. It bought exactly enough time for Cassandra to slip out the shed's back gap with the locket sewn into her coat lining, and for Tom to walk Beaufort all the way back to the bunkhouse, discussing harness leather with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once in his life thought about anything else. But word reached Vance by morning anyway, not of what was taken, only that someone had been in the shed, and Cornelius Vance was neither stupid nor slow, and he understood immediately what a burglary the night before his bonfire probably meant. He came looking for Cassandra Doyle directly, riding into the ranch yard where she worked with 2 hired men flanking him, and an expression arranged into perfect, wounded confusion, the same performance that had carried him through 4 counties and 4 names. "Miss Doyle, I understand my missing bride's wagon tracks led toward this outfit 2 days back. I'd hoped you might have news of her welfare. A woman in her condition, out alone, is a dangerous thing to leave to chance." "I've heard she's safe," Cassandra said, meeting his eyes without a flicker. "I've also heard some interesting things about a shed fire you've got scheduled for this evening, Mr. Vance. Seems an odd week for house cleaning, with a judge riding in tomorrow." Something behind Vance's eyes went cold and calculating for exactly 1 second before the wounded confusion slid back into place, and in that 1 second, Cassandra saw, at last, the actual man underneath 4 names and 8 months of beautiful letters, and understood precisely why her sister had stopped being able to write home the truth. "I don't believe we've been introduced properly, Miss Doyle," he said softly. "I find myself curious how a cattle hand comes to know so much about my private affairs." "Ask me again tomorrow, in front of Judge Price," Cassandra said. "I'll have a fuller answer for you by then." Judge Aldous Price held court in the back room of the Sweetwater Land Office on Thursday morning, and it was, by the account of everyone present, the strangest session that room had seen in a decade. Everett Kroll went first, and to his credit, he did not hedge one line of it, laying his private ledger on the judge's table, with his hands shaking and his voice steady, naming every payment, every rushed title transfer, every year. He had told himself the women had simply left. Ruth Ashford went second, identifying Cornelius Vance as the same man in Delia Fromm's photograph, under the name Jonas Reed, and producing the letter her family had received from Delia's sister Prudence, naming a third alias, Silas Kane, and a fire near the Nebraska line that the county had never properly answered questions about. Then Cassandra Merrick stood up in front of a room that had known her for a year only as Cassidy Doyle, gave her true name for the first time in 3 years in a public room, and set her sister's locket on the judge's table beside Kroll's ledger. "My sister Louisa Merrick married this man under the name Amos Teller 4 years ago," she said. She stopped writing home the truth within 6 months. Within a year she was gone, and the family was told she had run off. The same story Mr. Kroll's ledger shows has been told about at least 3 other women, under at least 3 other names this man has carried. "I found her locket in his shed 2 nights ago, in a hat box marked for burning ahead of this very court session. I do not know tonight whether my sister is alive. I know she did not leave this locket behind by choice, and I know a man does not burn 4 years of women's belongings the week a judge comes to town, unless he has a great deal to keep that judge from seeing." Cornelius Vance, to the end, was very good at his performance, and he stood and called it a conspiracy of a bitter woman and a hysterical bride and a corrupt clerk settling old scores, and for one long, terrible minute, Cassandra watched Judge Price's face and could not read which way it would fall. What decided it, in the end, was Tom Hartley, called as the final witness, confirming under oath the timing of the bonfire, the shed break-in he had assisted, and one detail he had saved for exactly this moment. 2 years back, shoeing horses for a rancher near the Nebraska line under the name Silas Kane, he had personally seen a young wife alive and frightened in that household 1 week before a fire the county ruled an accident, a wife whose face he could now see, sitting scared in the back of the courtroom, was not Ruth Ashford or Louisa Merrick at all, but a third woman entirely, one nobody in this room had known to look for until this very moment, because she had survived that fire and fled on foot, and had spent 2 years too afraid to come forward alone. Her name was Bethany Kane, and she had been sitting in the back of that Sweetwater courtroom for an hour, working up the courage to stand, and when Tom Hartley's testimony gave her the opening, she finally did. Judge Price did not need the gavel twice after that. Cornelius Vance, whose true birth name turned out to be Reuben Fenwick, was bound over for trial on charges spanning 3 counties, and the eventual proceedings, which took the better part of 2 years, uncovered a scheme that had run for nearly 7, funded by dowries and land titles taken from women whose families had been shamed into silence by a story that blamed the vanished instead of the man who made them vanish. Louisa Merrick was never found alive, and Cassandra Merrick, who had spent 3 years hoping otherwise, buried an empty grave beside her parents' plots the following spring, with her sister's locket laid inside it, and grieved, finally, in the open, under her own true name, surrounded by a town that had come, in 3 short days, to think a great deal more of Cassidy Doyle than the quiet cattle hand they thought they had known. Bethany Kane rebuilt a life in Sweetwater with Ruth Ashford's help, the 2 of them oddly bonded survivors of the same man under 2 different names, and Everett Kroll, granted the mercy Cassandra had promised him, spent his remaining years as the most scrupulously honest land clerk in the territory, a fact he mentioned, unprompted, rather often. As for Cassandra and Tom Hartley, the courtship that grew out of one impossible week was neither rushed nor dramatic, which suited them both. He had waited a year to ask her a single personal question. She had spent 3 years running from her own name. They took their time, as people do who have finally stopped running toward anything except each other, and married the following autumn in a ceremony so quiet and so entirely without spectacle that half of Sweetwater complained they had missed it entirely. Louisa Merrick's portrait, the one that had ridden inside that locket for 4 hard years, hangs today in the front room of the ranch house Cassandra and Tom built together, and Cassandra tells anyone who asks that her sister is the reason the door of that house is never locked, to a stranger in trouble, because the worst thing that ever happened to their family started with a story everyone agreed to believe, instead of a question somebody should have asked. If this story reached you, there is another waiting, complete from first hoofbeat to last, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit with me again soon. Somebody always needs the door left open,